Hallo und herzlich willkommen im Humboldt-Forum auf der ersten Etage, auf der Etage der Stiftung Stadtmuseum Berlin, wo die Ausstellung
Hello and a very warm welcome to the Humboldt Forum here on the first floor of the Stiftung Stadtmuseum Berlin, where you can visit the exhibition Berlin Global. This is also the framework in which tonight's event is taking place. One object, many questions on the topic of German colonialism under National Socialism. And I'm delighted to talk about this difficult but extremely important topic with Josephine Apraku. My name is Sophie Elliott and I work for the Stadtmuseum with a focus on outreach, and I will be your host for this evening. Maybe first a few remarks about what tonight will be about. It's about this object called Germany's Colonies, which is a classroom map from the year 1937. The very first question that we need to answer from the perspective of a museum is how do we deal with objects that show traces of colonialism and as such also racism? And from what perspectives can we look at these objects in question, and also what perspectives do we decide on? I'm delighted to look at this object from the perspective of the following question: how can we create solidarity and empowerment in dealing with these objects and at the same time open up rooms for reflection and talk about our political reality? And we can do this very well with Josephine Apraku. Since 2008, Josephine has been raising awareness on this and many other issues. Josephine teaches critical peace pedagogy and works with this approach, always from an intersectional perspective. Previously, Josephine did tours in Berlin's African Quarter and offers trainings for teachers on the topic of racism and colonialism. Josephine is an African studies scholar, author, and trainer for intersectional anti-racism sensibilization. Josephine teaches at Alice Solomon University, amongst others. And amongst Josephine's newest publications are the card said, "Let us talk about racism," as well as a workbook on racism published by Familiar Faces. The same publishing house published the book, "How Do I Explain Racism to Children?" Racism, Sensitive Empowerment from a Young Age Onwards, and we will also talk about this book this evening.
There are several changes in our program, so today we will be in this room together with Josephine, and then we will go to the room where the object is located, and we will be able to talk about that object. Brenda Spiesbach, my colleague, was supposed to be there. However, she injured herself, so I think Ms. Kimira will take over, but we'll go with the flow, and the rest of the evening will be a little bit spontaneous, but I'm sure that there are a lot of things that we will be able to talk about throughout this evening. So in any case, as long as Josephine is here, we of course want to give space and room for questions for Josephine, and of course we also have questions. We will be able to take questions when we look at the object. So what are we talking about today, and what are we actually looking at? So here we can see a school map or classroom map, and you can, in the middle you can see the African continent, and around it you can see the different regions that are supposed to point out German colonies. There are a lot of quotes from the NSDAP elite, which want to explain to school children from many different perspectives why Germany has a right for Lebensraum, a space to live, and what all of that has to do with colonies. In 1997, Germany had lost its colonies after the Treaty of Versailles, and so the quotes deal with the desire for regaining these colonies and also the logic behind it. And these quotes appear on different parts of this map. So when I prepared this evening, I wanted to try and figure out how I can approach this kind of object. And because we talk about the topic of racism and colonialism, and I'm a white red person, so I need to talk about how I approach this object and what are the focal points for me. So for me, I approached the object as follows. So Africa is presented on this map with all of these different stereotypes and cliches, with the argumentation or argumentative logic that we need these colonies because the people in these colonies need to be civilized. But no, that was really not the logic that we can see here. So I realized that I have a few knowledge gaps, and if you realize that there's some gaps in your knowledge, then you can, of course, it's always good to read books. For instance, here, this one by Susan Vaunt. And then, here, this map is about the right for living space in order to safeguard the German race. In 1935, there was the Nürnbergian blood law, and just a moment, please, and the law for the safeguarding of the German blood and German honor, the so-called blood protection law. And at the time, it was mainly referring to Romania. And at the time it was, and then transferred to the other colonies. Jews weren't supposed to deal with Turkish people, for instance, because according to the National Socialistic logic, Jewish and Turkish people were considered as white. So when we look at this map and try and understand what German colonialism and nationalism is all about, we need to ask ourselves the question of what being white means as a norm under National Socialism and what it means for us today. So now when I consider, this is my approach to the subject, so now, Josephine, I would like to ask you, so what perspectives do you look at these objects, and how would you consider the importance of the subject today? I think I can look at the subject from many different perspectives. So from the one hand side, I'm here the Berlin Friedrichstadt, not very far from the Berlin Humboldt Forum, and I did several tours in that area, but it is also important in this context to understand that political decisions were taken here with regard to Germany's colonial past, as well as Germany's effort to take part in colonialism. Not very far away from here, I think just 10 minutes by foot, the Berlin Africa Conference took place, for example, and in that context, for instance, also they decided how the African continent was supposed to be distributed, and then maybe another 5 minutes by foot from there, so right across from where we are sitting here at the moment, there was also an institute for some time during the NS period, and that institute was supposed to deal with the regaining of the once lost colonies and to make all of this possible from a political point of view if the Second World War would be won. And so they really prepared the end of the war, and one of these main foreign policy points or aspects was to regain these colonies, and that's the one perspective that I look at this topic from, because I did these different city tours, for instance, and I tried to point out these different periods and try to find out or point out the connections between these different periods, colonialism and National Socialism, for instance, and that's just one aspect of many different fragments. I still remember that in 2015 at the German History Museum there was an exhibition dealing with the German colonial past, and I believe that within that context there was also a curriculum that also included a curriculum for, I believe, primary school pupils. that included or presented the different colonies during the NS time with a desire to regain these colonies. So there are different kinds of references and connections, and I think it's also important for me currently because in Germany we're experiencing a kind of draw to the right of the political spectrum, but I think solidarity is also extremely important also in our day-to-day life. So why is it so important for us to understand the different kinds of forms of suppressions and also the different periods of suppression and trying to find a connection between these different periods? And so solidarity is important in this regard on the one hand side, but I think it is also important for us in order to understand the continuities in relations of suppressions and discrimination. I think one example could be, for instance, the first concentration camp or camp of destruction. I think for a while there was a discussion with regard to how these camps should be called. Should they be called camps of destruction or concentration camps? But there were some of these camps that were erected in Germany, in Namibia during the times of colonization. So we have this practice of these camps, which was also relevant during the NS time. But another aspect that was extremely important is to realize that people such as, I believe, Eugen Fischer at the time, who, did racist research on the Haifisch Island or the so-called Shark Island, already did that during the NS time. So there was a kind of overlapping in terms of personnel. So the people who were already active during the colonial period, but who also then were active in these areas during the NS time. So, you can see that even if, for instance, the groups that were affected differed. So I think there are different perspectives that we can look at these objects from. But, I am, of course, a black person living in Germany, and so the most important aspect for me right now is the continuity of these suppressions and how we can find solidarity across these different instances. So exactly, so explanations and, looking or trying to look at systems of suppressions. That's the basis for how you want to approach, explaining racism to children. That's also how you deal with this topic in your book. So, of course, there's research on the topic that in a very early age we learn that being white is a norm. So why did you write this book? And, we now we're dealing with an object that was located in a classroom, and so a system of suppression was, taught and people were indoctrinated. So now we need to explain how these systems of suppressions worked, and especially to children and young people. Exactly. So education and pedagogy is not neutral, but they're always used, for instance, to justify the current political or national system, also based on the current ideologies, and that was done during the NS time. But of course, this is also how it is done today. There's a lot of research and evidence pointing towards that. But I believe that this is exactly where we need to start, because if I assume that education is neutral, that also means that there is the possibility and also the responsibility to have this racism critical education, especially if we say that we want to live in a society that is based less on suppression. And of course, racism is one of many forms of suppression or oppression. And one of the other aspects that you mentioned is that educational sciences, but also social psychology, show that children at a very young age, at about 3 years old, can already have racist stereotypes, but at the very latest, when they go to school, they know whether they are white and belong to the so-called norm of the society, or whether they're affected by racism, so black people, or if they be POCs. So I think here we can also see the responsibility that we have. So we can't say, we're a society that is free from racism, but we need to understand that racism is part of our social structures, and that also means that if we want to change these structures and if we want to create equal opportunities, that we realize that education isn't neutral, but that it can be a means to an end in order to promote anti-discrimination and anti-racism, and that is also the background in which I created this book. So there was a first edition of this book in 2020, and at that time I wasn't involved in it at all. But in 2021, the publishing house approached me and asked me whether I wanted to review this book. But probably review is probably not the right word, because I actually really rewrote the whole book, but also because my approach to this topic is entirely different, but also because within my work it is important for me to include different perspectives that are not part of my lived reality. That also meant that from the one hand that we have interviews, for instance, with a psychologist about these different aspects that I already outlined, but also, for instance, a person who works as a teacher, but also worked at the anti-discrimination contact point in Berlin for schools, and so has a lot of experience, but also the two founders of Tibaloo. So it's a kind of online platform for toys that include aspects of diversity. And there are also people who wrote texts about different kinds of forms of racism in order to show, well, if we talk about this type of oppression, we talk about racism. But in racism research, they often talk about racisms, because there are different types of racisms that are connected, that might be different, and their structures and their points of referral are sometimes different. But what was extremely important for this book was that, you just, held up the book. It's not very thick. It's not very long. It's for people who haven't dealt with this topic very profoundly. So it's for people, it's supposed to be sort of a beginning point for people to understand, well, what does this topic of racism mean when you deal with children, and what does it mean for children in general? So an aspect that is extremely important for my work is that I try and always make sure that I write in such a way that I don't just write for people positioned as white, but that I, always kind of, take a step back and make sure that I also want to include people who are affected by racism, such as me, for instance, because they also need to learn about it, because it can be very empowering if you understand the underlying structures, and if you realize that it's not just your personal perception, but that it's a collective experience in which you're included. Yes, I think that's extremely important in the book as well. We always point out just exactly what you said. Racism isn't just a task for people who are not affected, but also for people who are affected. It affects all of us, also children and young adults, so we need to start very, very early. And as we've seen with this map, and you also mention it very clearly in this book, education for children at the time under National Socialism really were supposed to learn what this blood law meant. There was also, in biology, they learned a different hierarchy of the different races. Of course, the Aryan people were on the top, and then the bottom were the black people, the people from the desired colonies, and then the animals, etc. And so then the pupils were supposed to do different tasks based on this hierarchy or this hierarchical myth. But today we want to talk about colonialism as well, and so this is an illustration by Lyon, who illustrated your book, I believe. It is called Imperialism, States and the Colonies around 1914. So it is important to talk about what German colonialism is. What is German colonialism from your point of view?
Ich glaube, es macht sicherlich Sinn, deutschen Kolonialismus auch als eine spezifische Form. Well, this is a big question. I think it's important to look at German colonialism from
from both perspectives, from all perspectives. So we need to understand it as something that's collective and mostly white European. So of course they were in competition with one another, but I think we could also see very clearly, especially looking at the map that we saw in the very beginning, that one of the reasons that colonies were even relevant during the Nazi time is that regaining the colonies was very important to the regime because they wanted to look good when compared to other European nations. And from a European perspective, it was about recreating the honor that had been lost because of the Treaty of Versailles and because of losing the colonies. I think it's also important to understand that German colonialism is particular in the way that the German narrative about it is that the Germans entered the race quite late. So Germany only started to get colonies in 1884. That's when they started to strive to get colonies, and this happened because of the Berlin Conference on African colonies. And so there were deputies from mostly European countries. I think the US were also represented, and there was also somebody from the Ottoman Empire, but mostly European nations. And so Germany tried to get their foot in the door and to really access to becoming and to really access the road to becoming a global power. But German colonial times are a comparatively short time, and so that's why many people in Germany tend to understand it as something that's not so relevant as a part of our history because it only lasted for about 30 years. But understanding colonialism and Germany's involvement in it is something that we need to think of the bigger picture. In Ghana in the 1670s or 90s, I'm not quite sure, they created a territory called Great Friedrichsburg, and this was really a part of Prussia at the time. And it was a way to enslave people, and it was under Prussian administration, and it was really it wasn't really a part of the competition. In 1694 many more people were sent across the ocean as enslaved people than from any other spot in Africa. And so it's very important that we don't just consider this time between 1884-85 until 1918, but rather I think it's important that we keep in mind that many elements of colonialism go back far further. So the transatlantic slave trade is one aspect. And also other aspects. I hate using the word racist theory, but racist ideology that was created at the time. People such as Immanuel Kant. So he really had a theory that was based on weather, and his assumption was that white people are superior because they live in a time zone and in a part of the world where there are 4 seasons, and because they're not constantly in hot weather. And so people who are on the other side of the equator, closer to the equator, they are influenced by the sun in a way that their intellect cannot develop to the same extent. So those were his ideas, and so even before the formal entering into the colonial race, these ideas were prevalent. And so how relevant the colonial time is and how large this period is, I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. And so of course in 1937 all of this was still relevant. And it's also important to keep in mind for how long human zoos were happening, or what they called it at the time, ethnological expositions. And so there was a German a German person who was black but who was actually in the zoo of Hamburg, Hagenbeck, and who was shown there just before the beginning of the Second World War. There was also the German Africa exposition that happened in, I believe, 1937 or lasted until 1940. I'm not quite sure. We're going to look at the map in a moment, but I want to point out one more aspect. This is another image taken from your book, and so it mentions aspects such as religion, prejudice, race, colonialism, discrimination, skin color, and origin. And so you are frequent guests in many podcasts, and I actually listened to the Empower Me podcast, where you... So Empower Me is a Berlin empowerment project for children who are affected by racism, and perhaps you want to tell us a little something about that, maybe share a personal experience. In the podcast interview, you mentioned that when you learned about the Nazi time in school, you felt a connection to Anne Frank. Do you want to talk about that? Yes, I can actually remember this quite well. I remember that in the years before that, and my own learning, my own knowledge about the NS times and the colonial times, it was something that was very present in my memory. And this lesson really called it to the front that I hadn't learned much about colonial times at all. And what I remember most is that I was in the advanced class for English, and so for French, English, and Spanish. So when learning one of these languages in classes, the topic of colonialism is covered more frequently than in history classes in Germany. And so that's where we learned about the transatlantic slave trade and terms such as the triangle trade, which don't really show very clearly that we're talking about slave trade here and about trading people. So it's something that's not always made very clear. And I also remember reading the diary of Anne Frank while I was in primary school, and I felt a connection to her not because I was affected by anti-Semitism, but because I could see some similarities in that there was some secret agreement how society is supposed to work. So I was a black child in school, and everybody said, oh, we all like you the same, you're all worth the same. But of course I noticed that this wasn't the case, and that's an experience that I keep having. And so it was actually helpful to me in some way, even though I look at this very critical from today's perspective. But I do appreciate that there was some dealing with the NS times that wasn't just focused on anti-Semitism, or at least that's how it should have been, because I think it's important that we understand the structures underneath. It wasn't just this one person who may have done something bad, but it's really a whole society and society structures. And so this is something I noticed very early on without being able to name it. So speaking about the structure of society, that's something that actually comes up on this map. So you can see the logic and the argumentation, the right to having a living space for the Germans. And we cannot actually talk about every single aspect in detail, but colonial products, I think that's something that's very important. So you see the extract here, Europe and the African colonies. And so you see southwestern Africa and also areas such as Samoa and Cameroon and Togo. So these were colonies that were sought after in order to be able to maintain the German blood. That's what it was called at the time. And so importing and exporting colonial products, that's something that's mentioned here with some numbers: oilseeds, sisal, coffee, phosphates, cotton, skins and furs, and cocoa. So they're all mentioned here. I don't have any questions about this particular image. I would just like to know what you have to say about it.
Ich glaube, was ich total spannend finde ist, und ich gehe nochmal zurück auf den Aspekt,
I think what's interesting, and here I'd like to come back to what you asked me beforehand, which is how relevant was the German colonialism, or how would I consider Germany in terms of being a colonial nation. There's one aspect that's very important, especially looking at this extract, this image. In Germany, when people talk about colonialism, they try to take themselves out of the picture. We even see this in school manuals. And so I remember when comparing how the way the colonial past was portrayed in the 1970s and 80s up to the 2010s. But what we also can see clearly when looking at this map is that Germany at a time was the third largest colonial territory. So it wasn't a case of, oh, we were the last ones and we weren't a major player at all. That's not the case. And so during the NS times, they explicitly mentioned colonial products. And in history books, and this is actually a reality, what is often shown is that for Germany, the colonialism wasn't very profitable at all. So a lot more money went into the colonies than what was extracted from the colonies. And so it's interesting that they're pointing out that these products are an important aspect. And so specifically on the African continent,
immer noch vor allem Produkte sozusagen hergestellt, angebaut,
even all the way up to the present,
it's still, die schon während der Kolonialzeit relevant waren.
It's still the case that many products are still produced or exported that were already relevant during colonial times. And so in some countries we're seeing some major changes. And so there's the challenge of dealing with free trade agreements that really just mean that the raw products, the raw materials are being sold to Europe, but otherwise the taxes are so high that it doesn't really make sense to work with the products and sell the finished products. But this also leads to an effective colonial dependencies. So that means that we can get cheap products in Europe. So gemstones are extremely important. When uncut, they are fairly cheap, but once they've been cut in Europe, the profit margin, of course, is much larger. So the money is really made in Europe. And so in some areas we can see that countries are approaching this differently now. So the right to sourcing the gemstones, for instance, these are remaining in the country. So only people who live in this country and have always lived there have this right. But this also means that no uncut gemstones can be exported at all. So that means that the profit margin really remains within the country. And that's relevant because there are still some colonial structures that we can still see today. This relates to what kind of products are being farmed, what kind of products are being sold. And so of course, many colonial countries are still facing a lot of pressure from European countries to keep doing things this way. I also want to mention climate change. I think it's relevant to mention this. There are many maps that really show how intensely climate change has been affected by colonialism. So in New Zealand, you can really see the deforestation that started with colonial times, and it really shows how drastic the deforestation was. I think it was up to 20% of the original trees that were still there after 20 years of colonialism. So after 80 years of colonialism. So the climate crisis isn't just a crisis of the present, but it's a crisis that is closely related to capitalism and, of course, to colonialism. Something else I'm noticing on the map is that the people in the colonies are not being talked about at all. They only mention surface areas and square meters. And when looking at the colonial products, of course, this also leads to the questions to what kind of labor is needed to create these products. So I want to mention this book. Unfortunately, it's unavailable at the moment, but I do hope that some of you get the opportunity to take a look at this. It's called Grenzenlos, so without borders.
Ihr da euch angeguckt habt.
And so you were a part of the publishing process, and so you looked at the destinies of people who worked on these products and the resistance that happened. So we cannot talk about this in detail today. We don't have the time, but I think it's another relevant aspect to keep in mind.
Tatsächlich ist es vielleicht ein guter Übergang zu dem, was du gerade
I think that's actually quite a good transition. So their labor, the labor of these people really is invisible. And so this book, this project, it was created for the Labor Museum in Hamburg. And labor is really the key term. So colonialism, industrialization, and resistance. I think that's the title. I can never quite remember the title. But what we're focusing on in this book, which was a part of the museum and the exposition, is that we really wanted to take a different perspective in the book compared to the exposition itself. So we have some artifacts in the Labor Museum, and so production facilities where caoutchouc or rubber were produced. And these were products that were originally produced in the colonies, so that's an aspect that we mention. We also have some biographies of resistance, and it's important to mention our perspective because there might be different perspectives on resistance, and we wanted to show all of them. And even when we talk about resistance today, we usually talk about people who were comparatively privileged. So they were able to resist in a way that's visible, but there's also a lot of invisible resistance, which isn't really featured in the history books. And so resistance was also a day-to-day business, so boycotting labor in one way or another, but not just that. Also looking at female bodies or bodies that were perceived as females. It was also about making sure that less babies were being born. And so resistance can have many different faces, and we wanted to point to that in the book, and it was very important for us to have an intersectional perspective, so we wanted to keep all different kinds of oppression in mind and feature them. So of course people who are affected by racism, but also different aspects such as current ideas of binary gender roles that are also in part influenced by colonialism, and the racist ideology often also included that, of course, white people have a clear binary gender. And so there were some societies, of course, in which gender identity was not very important at all. But we wanted to, of course, show these two aspects and show how the white hierarchy was important to the gender aspect as well. Another line of argument is how many square kilometers of Lebensraum, of living area, there is for the Germans, so how much space do the Germans have compared to other nations? And there's a quote by Hitler himself. So he says, Germany cannot relinquish their colonial claims. The right to live of the German people is just as important as the right of other nations. And so then it's about the distribution of the world's surface. How living spaces are distributed is extremely important, and our youth need to be familiar with this as early as possible. And this is what the Minister of Culture said in 1933. And so he talks about the distribution of the Earth's surface, and the question is asked, is this a fair distribution? So from an anti-racist and educational perspective, what would you recommend as to how we talk about this in the classroom?
nochmal auch aus einer anderen Perspektive zu sprechen.
So just to give you a different perspective, I work and have worked with educators quite a bit. And so what I like to do is to do an exercise where we look at, where we critically reflect on the material that is provided for the classroom, because there is still a lot of racism in that. And I often get the question, well, what kind of material is free of racism, or what kind of material is good to use? But I think it's, of course, possible to teach in a way that's critical of racism, but of course our material might be racist. And so we can look at this material with our students and reflect on it in a critical way and compare it to how we look at these matters today. And so when looking at current material for geography lessons, for instance, you often see ideas of, the African continent being overpopulated, the African population growing too fast, and Germany is a fairly old country. I'm 36 years old, and I'm still, I think, 6 years away from the average age in Germany, and I think that's quite intense. And so for many countries in this world, this is not the case. But, Germany is growing in a way that in the way it should be growing, and so it's presented in a positive way compared to countries in Africa. And especially when looking at the different lines of argument, we can really, that helps us understand how power and the authority to decide what's being taught, how these two are interwoven. And so during the NS times, it was the narrative that Germany needs to expand. And today the narrative is that Germany is a country that's looking towards the future and fit for the future, because the population isn't growing as fast as it is in some other countries. But what isn't mentioned at all is that in terms of the density of population, it's actually quite a lot higher in Germany compared to many African countries. So the former colony of German Southwest Africa, so today that's Namibia, it's about as large as France and Germany together, and the population is at about 2 million people. So just to put up this comparison.
Ich gucke mal kurz auf die Zeit, genau. Noch Abner steht, also wie gesagt, die NSDAP-Elite wird
so the NSDAP elite is often quoted, for instance, here, Colonel General Göring, Minister President, the opening of the Colonial exhibition in Frankfurt on May 1932, and on this colonial exhibition, well, I wasn't actually able to find anything about it, anything that I could add, but he is quoted as follows: Our objective has to be the following: a new Germany, great in its honor and its freedom and its labor, and colonies will be a brazen part of this objective. And so this connection, or all of these different connections on this map, you have the colonial products, you have education in schools, colonial exhibition, and of course you can also assume that the pupils were also sent to this colonial exhibition. So there are all of these connections, and we can see that this ideology really spread to all of these different parts of society. I think that's a very interesting point. And I have two associations. One, this makes me think of Karl Gustav Nachtigall. Interestingly enough, he was actually a colonialist, but now people often portray him as an African scholar or scientist. Why? Because the Humboldt University is located across, and they had one of the first institutes for regional studies, which was founded during colonial times in order to be able to colonize better, and this actually was only established after he left the African continent. It's important to mention that because he didn't really have any expertise or education in that. From today's perspective, of course, it would have been very problematic, but this field of study didn't actually exist at the time. He was just a traveling person who wrote diaries, and today, if I, for instance, went on holiday and wrote some diaries about my travels, from their point of view, I would be Portugal scientist, for instance. But another aspect that is important for me is that his diaries sold very well, actually. And I think that's an extremely important topic, because during colonial times there was hardly any contact with the colonies. So people such as Kant, for instance, they wrote down all of these racist things without ever, in his case, having left Prussia. So I think it's extremely important to understand that people wanted to understand what this, apparently mystical thing is, this great foreign thing. But of course there were all of these colonial exhibitions, and also these zoo exhibitions that we mentioned earlier, but also the ones that were located at fairgrounds, and these were really magnets for the audience. Loads of people went to these exhibitions. These weren't just individual curiosities that happened every now and again, but they were really also marketed at large. So it was possible to buy a souvenir, for instance. Sometimes, there were certain traditional production methods, for instance, how people cooked meat, and then people were able to try that, and this really attracted people. It was a sort of form of entertainment, and I think it's important to point that out, because this was also a format or a form of social education that followed the racist narrative, that is making people strangers, and they tried to somehow create an alleged authenticity via things that we perceived as foreign, and sometimes there were these real exhibitions on these issues.
Und das wäre ein letzter Ausschnitt aus der Karte, wo jetzt
this is one last fragment of the map, and Hans Schem, chairman of the NS Teacher Association, and he said the following, I quote, "One of the most important tasks of German schools and German educators consists in relentlessly awakening and promoting the colonial interests in children." End of quote.
Bei diesem Zitat habe ich mich gefragt,
and when I read that quote,
bei dieser Karte,
and actually when I looked at the whole map, I asked myself,
die Ausweitung des Lebensraums wünscht, gehört dann eigentlich zu solcher Propaganda.
Of course, Germany wants to expand its Lebensraum, its living space, so these kind of myths are part of that, preparing for the war, for instance.
Wo heute Kinder und Jugendliche
and so now,
halt
today, children and young people, they don't really have a direct part in German colonialism, but what would you say, what would be the most important role of German schools in terms of colonialism under National Socialism? Well, I think on the one hand we need to keep thinking about that time and remember it, because it's also relevant today. I just talked about free trade agreements and the climate crisis, and these are two very concrete examples that show that colonialism is still relevant today. And of course we've also mentioned racism critical education. That is another aspect, I believe, because with colonialism and since colonialism up to the present, our society is a racist society. So this knowledge is still there, and it's still part of our curricula, even if it is in a different, manner. But of course, for instance, the degradation of the African continent and of black people in general, all of these things exist till today. And if we want to understand racism, if we want to also fight against racism in Germany, and if we want to perceive or see that there is no equality, and because we just don't have the same, conditions in the beginning, then it is extremely important to understand current racism and to also look at colonialism and realize that maybe formally it is ended, but our present is still a very, very colonial present.
Mit diesen Worten würde ich auch die Annäherung an den Objekt mit Josephine erstmal abschließen.
I would like to end this part of our event talking about this object together with Josephine. And so I would like to open the floor for your questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for that. Of course, I still have a lot of questions for Josephine, but now, the floor is yours.
verabschieden wir uns an dieser Stelle von Josephine Apraku.
So I would like to say goodbye to Josephine Apraku. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, especially, here in this location. And, till the next time, goodbye.